Welcome to the Exceptional Contribution to the Biography Prize. Before I talk about the prize, I just wanted to say a huge thank you to Max for lending us this beautiful set of rooms. I think they really are almost the most beautiful rooms in London. We are incredibly privileged. Well, the Exceptional Contribution to Biography Prize is a prize which is usually awarded to biographers. And if you look at the past list of prize winners, you have a sort of roll call of all the great and golden names of the last few decades in biography. Richard Holmes, Michael Holroyd, Antonia Fraser, Hermione Lee, they are all there. You're in very good company. This year, the committee decided that it would be an excellent and wonderful idea to sort of widen the scope of the prize and to award it to Matthew Parris for his contribution to biography, exceptional contribution, and unusual, unique contribution as presenter of the programme Great Lives, which Matthew has done since 2006, which is quite a long haul, and I'm sure you'll have lots of stories and things to tell us about it. I don't need to introduce Matthew Parris to you. I think everybody knows him too well. I'll just say that Matthew Parris was an MP from 1979 to 1986, I think, and since then has had a sparkling and glittering career in journalism as a brilliant parliamentary sketch writer, and then also currently, of course, as a weekly column. And I don't know about anybody in the audience, but I never find my weekend is never complete unless I read my Matthew Parris. I'm going to award you your prize.
Is it chocolates?
Very few chocolates. And Evan Davies is going to introduce and be in conversation with Matthew. And again, Evan is a star radio journalist, currently presenting PM, from which he came hot foot this evening.
It's not far.
So thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
May I, just before we talk, Evan, just thank you very much for this. There is, I have a feeling of guilt about it because biographers are distinguished by their knowledge about the people whose biography they write. My whole job as the presenter of Great Lives is really not to know anything much about what I write and to ask questions. Exceptional contribution, yes, I think that's acceptable. The awful thing is lifetime achievement. I had a lodger who was a little bit of a comedian, quick-minded, and some years ago I bent down very suddenly in my flat and farted involuntarily. And Tom, my lodger, said, "And so it begins." Lifetime Achievements Awards, yes, so it begins. But I think exceptional, that's fine.
Actually, it was originally called the Lifetime Achievement.
With that, I shall sit down.
Well, it's a great pleasure, Matthew, to be here with you. I've long been an admirer of Matthew as a broadcaster and a columnist, and I first heard his name when I was precocious, kind of just out of university, and used to watch a programme called Weekend World with the great Brian Walden. I don't know if many of you can remember. Yes. That was ahead of its time in analytical television. And Brian Walden stepped down, and Matthew Parris was a guy who came and left Parliament, as Brian Walden had done, to take over this coveted spot. And well, there was some good news and bad news there, wasn't there?
I failed.
So actually there was a poll the other day about the all-time greatest Sunday political show, best interviewers. Brian Walden scored a few percent. Andrew Marr, I think, was top, because obviously everybody knows Andrew Marr, that's what he's been doing recently. The good news and bad news, man. The good news is that you were actually included in the list of available candidates.
Below you, I think.
No, I wasn't there. The bad news was that you didn't get any. You got 0% of the vote.
Well, I got 1%.
You got 1% from the Tories, 0 from the others, but I'm afraid to average of 0. What actually did happen? Because we've talked about this before, but we will get to Great Lives. But what happened at Weekend World? Why did that not work? You're a very accomplished, successful biographer, interviewer, thinker, journalist. Why did Weekend World last 2 years and stop when you were running?
I think 3 things. Firstly, Brian Walden was very, very good. And anyone who remembers him will remember how good he was. There was something larger than life about him with his slightly odd way of speaking and his faint West Midlands accent and his eccentric approach to questioning that nobody could ever forget. He was also very, very shrewd and managed to be at the same time polite and actually fatally inquisitive quite often. He rather twisted Mrs. Thatcher around his little finger. I could never get Mrs. Thatcher to come on the programme because I had caused a by-election by leaving Parliament in order to do the programme. So one of the things that helped kill Weekend World was that we never could and never would get the Prime Minister of the day. The other, I think, was that it was a programme that was actually coming to the end of its natural life. And Brian had prolonged its natural life just by his particularly quirky genius. It was a programme, as some of you remember, that started with a 20 or 25 minute compilation, as we called it, setting out the parameters of the discussion, the problem we were going to be talking about, the questions that the minister or leader of the opposition or whoever was going to have to answer. After that long introduction, I would then have 15 to 20 minutes to talk to the woman or man in question and put to them all the questions which we seem to have arisen from our compilation. It was a bit clunky. It was a little bit mechanical feeling, and it was slightly out of date, except I found for Nigerian politics students, wherever I went on the underground, Nigerian politics students would go, "Are you Matthew Parris?" So yes, we watched your programme. It's very important for the thing that we're doing. So Brian kept it going, and I couldn't really keep it going, and that was that. I was perfectly professional. I'm reasonably quick-witted. I knew the sort of questions to ask, but I didn't have that flash of genius that Brian had.
Well, fortunately, your career didn't end there, and you built up a multimedia portfolio, including radio, and of course, Matthew, including Great Lives. I was trying to count how many you had done by running through the Wikipedia of them all yesterday. But I lost track whether I was at 200 or 300.
It's 400 or 500.
It is, I just gave up. But it is hundreds and hundreds. Now, just tell us, because people here do listen to it and like the programme, what determines who is featured in the programme? And I suppose it's 2 parts, that isn't it?
Yes.
The guest and the,
yes.
and the character.
And really it's only the guest, because we look at men and women who are of some account in public life or who will be known to quite a few of our Radio 4 audience, and we approach them. It's my series producer, I have nothing to do with it. The presenter never has anything to do with these things.
Don't tell them that now!
We approach them and ask if there's any life that they would like to champion. And if they say Winston Churchill, we say we've done him. Elizabeth first, yes, we've done
She's
her.
been twice.
She's been twice.
Mother Teresa.
Brunel, yes, we've done Brunel, and so on. And then we go with the life that they've chosen. We have never said to any of our guests, this life is inappropriate. We've only ever said we've done this life before.
It's interesting because one of the nice things is you can be in one series, Rommel and Lucille Ball. I mean,
yes.
it is.
And Mussolini in our last series, which Margaret MacDonald was very very bravely chose.
I mean, interested in the baddies, and
Yes.
you know, because people do nominate baddies, and can a baddie, Guy Burgess or something, be a great life?
Yes, absolutely. We use great in the loosest possible sense of the word. Just tight enough not to include Adolf Hitler. I would have thought no one has opposed him, but if they did, I think we would say no. But to Margaret, we did say yes to Adolf Hitler, and she was jolly good. You know,
Mussolini.
Sorry, Mussolini. She was very clear that she was no great admirer of Mussolini's, but she thought that he was, in many ways, an underrated person as a statesman, as the builder of modern Italy, and all the rest. I want to do the devil, or Lucifer, and I want to get someone. We can have imaginary characters. We've had Tintin, an episode on which I caused headlines on the continent by suggesting that it's obvious that Tintin was gay. Ask yourself the questions. How many women does he know? He only knows opera divas. He has a little Scotty dog who is the only heterosexual person in the entire thing. He lives with 2 old sailors. It's absolutely obvious. So we can have slightly imaginary characters.
Yeah, you had William, actually, just William.
Just William,
Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
we did him with Ritual Chronicle as well.
Yeah.
So yes, but I'd like to do the devil. I'd actually like to get an atheist to do Jesus Christ. I think that would be interesting. And I'm looking for somebody to do Pablo Escobar, who is a really significant figure in Colombian history, and more important than just a wicked drugs baron.
It's nice that in each series there's normally 1 or 2 that basically you would know nothing about and may well not have heard of at all, because great lives can be the unknown life as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, very important. One of the accusations, and actually this is not an accusation of the programme, but obviously the programme doesn't just come across as old generals and Churchill and the people who you'd see on statues, but we're obviously at a time where we are, I suppose, in the midst of a bit of a debate about who the greats are and who the greats are not, and you know, Cecil Rhodes, should we be dethroning him?
I'd love to do Cecil
I mean,
Rhodes.
I don't think he's been on.
Can't get anyone to do it, as you say. I mean, it illustrates your point.
Well, I mean, where are you on the kind of great lives, that sort of old white men, colonialists? Do we want to think of them as great? Do we want to?
Well, quite a few old white men were very important old white men, and whether you're pleased that it was old white men that were important or not, they were extremely significant figures, and so I like to do. I just yesterday recorded Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and what an interesting life, and I didn't know what an admirable character he was, and I'd be very sorry if we didn't do the Roosevelts, but I would also be sorry if we didn't do the people no one had ever heard of. We had a wonderful African poet, his name escapes me, but it'll come back to me, who chose a prince of Ethiopia, who was at the age of about 9 when Italian forces vanquished the Ethiopian Empire for a little while, sent to Britain as a sort of trophy, and Queen Victoria kind of brought him up. And at the end of the programme, I asked, interesting life, fascinating life, but how can it have been a great life? And my guest said he was a great life who never was. So we're really relaxed about that kind of thing.
Well, yeah, so a very important thing, another sort of, I suppose, with the same with the challenge to some figures who would be called establishment figures from the 19th century, and whether we need to reappraise them, is a sense that society has become more respectful of ordinary people in the last 30 years, and whether we can find ordinary people who are great lives, worthy of biography, and whose life tells a story. And do you get many candidates of sort of ordinary people on great lives, sort of great ordinary lives?
Well, you know, if I could get, who knows, a Keir Starmer or William Hague to nominate their aunt, I would do it because of the guest, and I would be interested in the role that they thought their aunt had played in their life. Otherwise, you tend not to get people who have no following at all, But you do get all kinds of people that I had never heard of, and that I've heard of after the event. But the other big thing, drawing on what you're saying about times changing, is women. Here is a really shaming statistic. My series editor did the maths and looked at the figures about 2 years ago now. We had done about 400 Great Lives at that time. Of all the men whom we had chosen as our studio guests, start with the women. Of all the women that we had chosen as our studio guests, half had chosen a man and half had chosen a woman. Of all the men that we did of our studio guests, all had chosen another man except for two people, one of whom was Michael Howard, who'd chosen Elizabeth I. And it's a pretty shaming statistic. So we do our absolute level best to level that up. But it is difficult because plenty of women who might have been great or who behind the scenes were great are not remembered.
The history isn't recorded.
Yes.
Of whatever. Yeah. No. Now, Matthew, you wrote a book yourself called Fracture, in which you tried. You drew a pattern from some of what you had observed of the kind of the many guests who had featured on the programme. I'm reducing it all here, but essentially, childhood trauma seems to be a seed that can create greatness and an interesting, at least, life, a big life, let's say. Talk us through that thesis.
Well, there are seeds of the eucalyptus trees in the Australian bush that will not germinate until there has been a bushfire which cracks the hard external surface of the seed and allows the kernel to sprout the new tree. And my theory is that it's more than a theory, it is derived from all those lives that I've done, so many of whom seem to have started, so many of which seem to have started in an absolute car crash of a childhood, more than ordinary statistics could possibly suggest would be the case. I came to the conclusion that it's not the case that if you mess up your child's childhood, they are likely to prove a genius. But it is the case that
important writers.
it is the case that amongst those people whom we judge to have been geniuses in some way, a much higher proportion than you would suppose have had car crashes of childhoods. They have crawled from the wreckage of parentless childhoods, orphaned childhoods where the mother was a prostitute, the man was a drug addict, absolutely awful childhoods. Huge family rows, Abraham Lincoln's hatred of his father, for instance. I could talk all night about those lives. And so my conclusion is that if your life has gone well from childhood onwards, from the nursery, from school, from loving parents, from living in a world that seems to be quite a kind world that has looked after you, shielded you, knowing parents who love you and parents' friends who are basically good people, nice people, something in you, some sense of rebellion, some sense of standing back at the world and asking what's wrong with the world, and also thinking of ideas that would be revolutionary in the world in which you've been brought up, is stifled, is suffocated. If at some point in your life as a child you had wept into your pillow, if you had a pillow, and thought the world is all wrong, everything is all wrong, nobody loves me, nobody understands me, the world that I know has got its values all wrong, so many of the things that people have told me are conventional wisdoms seem to be turned on their head in my life. If you ever had that bitter moment in childhood, and it can be an instantaneous moment, or it could be a whole period in your childhood, you are more likely to be able to stand back and ask questions about the world that the world doesn't want to answer. You ask questions about whether received scientific wisdom is right, as Marie Curie did. Ask questions about why the world does not accept that a woman could be a scientist, as Marie Curie did, ask questions as Abraham Lincoln did about why things were as they were, why untruths were so prevalent, why nobody, well, his father wouldn't even let him read, and he tried to read, and his father wouldn't let him write, and he tried to scrawl onto bits of wood because he wanted to write so much. Those questions, in separating you from the world, allow you to stand back from the world. I'm trying very hard not to use the phrase "think outside the box," but that is actually the phrase that I've got in mind.
In the book you acknowledge Alison Parente, a friend of yours,
Yes.
for advising you, and I think you thought this was good advice, go light on the theory,
Yeah.
Matthew. go with the stories rather than the theory. So I wonder whether the theorising is, because we don't really do statistical studies of how much trauma was around in there. Charlie Chaplin, terribly difficult childhood, but boy, a lot of people had really pretty difficult childhoods.
Yeah.
And then we just don't know much about them because they didn't become superstars. And I mean, so it is whether, I suppose, theory about human motivation and drive and whether they work or whether they make.
Yes.
They just is it a good way of stringing together a lot of stories about people, or is it truly a robust piece of social science?
It isn't a robust piece of social science, but it wasn't a way of stringing together a lot of stories. It's an insight, an intuition, a guess that I've had that I think is very strong, but that I know you could never prove scientifically. As Alison, who was a child psychiatrist, pointed out, all my terms, genius, greatness, car crash, childhood, there is no way that scientifically you could define those terms, you could contain those things in a way that allowed you to link things together and make a useful scientific correlation. She said you might as well give up. But she said there may be a stroke of genius, or an idea there, but it's better that it comes through from the stories, and she was right.
I wonder what other theories, though, one might, having done the kind of let's not over-theorise, do any other attributes come through? So let me mention some. Non-conformism, is that a feature of great lives? Do you feel non-conformism? Does that sing through?
Do you mean in the religious sense?
Well, no, I just mean that people who are eccentric or different or a bit weird, or maybe that comes out of,
yes.
You've said thinking outside the box, actually, so maybe that is, because I feel that there are some people who are just better, unconventional, they're just unconventional, and for a lot of people unconventional makes a terrible life. They just feel uncomfortable, they're estranged from others, but unconventionality can be an incredibly useful attribute.
Many of my lives did have terrible lives. Many of them lived nerve-wracked lives full of anxiety and unhappiness and lack of personal fulfillment. Some got through it to enjoy a sort of autumn sunshine in their lives, but many didn't. If you ask what makes a person non-conformist, sometimes it will be circumstances in their lives where they see that conformity hasn't worked for them. Even in the religious sense, Unitarians, Quakers, for instance, religious non-conformists, out of all proportion to their numbers, have been successful. Poor little Edward Lear, for instance, realised, well, he didn't realise because nobody knew what epilepsy was, but his epilepsy manifested itself starting from the age of about 5. He also realised that he was gay much later. He also suffered from absolutely terrible fits of depression where he could hardly lift his head, and he was his mother's 21st of 22 children, and she had no time or love left for him. And this poor little boy, sent to live with an aunt who told him that masturbation was a visitation from God for your sinful thoughts. This poor little boy escaped into a world of his own, a world in which there were demons and monsters and fairies and all kinds of things, a world in which, for instance, his epilepsy, he called the demon, and he would put in his diary, he kept a diary from a little boy, as from being a little boy, he would put in his diary visitations by the demon. His depression he called the morbids, and he would talk in the stories he made up in his own mind about being visited by the morbids. It is impossible to imagine Edward Lear and the Owl and the Pussycat going to sea in a sea green boat and all that. Impossible to imagine him without knowing about the childhood that he had had.
The other thing I suppose that also helps with a great life is luck. I mean,
oh yes.
Marie Curie stumbled on something, or she made some luck, but obviously she might have been working, and there may be 100 Marie Curies who had all of the drive and all of the scientific application, but just it didn't work. It led nowhere. We never hear about them. I wonder whether there should be a series, and whether biographers like the audience here should be writing more books about life's great losers, the not quite such great lives, the ones that really but for a bit of luck would have been a very great life, but we never hear about
Such
them.
an interesting question. I was talking to a friend of mine, a political friend of mine, about this, and he was talking about contingencies and how contingency can be the thing that makes the difference between being a success and a failure. But after we talked about it for a while, we had to conclude that you must divide contingencies into two categories. If you are not particularly fleet of foot, or your sense of balance isn't very great, you may trip over a stone and fall over, and that fall may direct the rest of your life. But if you hadn't tripped over that stone, you would have tripped over another one.
Yeah.
Those are the contingencies that will discover genius as opposed to make good fortune.
Yeah, no, that's a very fair point. Now, I know some of you might have questions. I want to take those. I do also want to talk about Matthew and his own life a little bit.
Interesting.
We don't want to pry too much, but I do want to talk a little bit about his own activities. But I thought I might open up some questions first. So I have plenty more, but I'm also going to hog the questioning. So let's take a few questions, and then I'll come back and put some away. Yes, sir. Why don't you? Yes, go ahead.
I just want to ask Matthew's reaction to the expression "behind every great man." Because behind every great man, there's a very surprised mother-in-law.
Yes.
Behind every great man, there stands a woman. I mean, have you been conscious of that? And then, how conscious are you of that? Has that been a theme running through some of these lives?
No, it hasn't really. Probably because of once we go back to the beginning of the 20th century and further back than that, you're really talking about women who are very much in the background. It's always the man is the great life, the woman is in the background, and you wouldn't know, and there isn't any way, because biography finds it hard, I think, to establish these things, how important the woman in question was. She might have been very important, but you don't know. We can't find out. Quite often, the woman was important just in providing a stable background to the man, as these days there are plenty of men, Dennis Thatcher comes to mind, who were important providing a stable background to the woman. The stability you can kind of guess at, but the inspiration, I think, is harder to divine.
Let's take this one from the front, please.
I just wondered which part of your very varied career have you enjoyed most?
Oh, now I'm almost literally now, but I just love it. I have failed at about 6 different things. I wasn't all that good at school, but I did just get into Cambridge. I wasn't all that good at Cambridge, but I did just get a master's degree at Yale. I completely flunked my master's degree. I just went to parties and met Andy Warhol and things like that. I came back to join the Foreign Office. After 2 years in the Foreign Office, it was clear I'd failed, or I wasn't going anywhere as a civil servant. I joined the Conservative Research Department, sent me over to Mrs. Thatcher's office. I let her down badly in a series of terrible errors of judgment that I made. I then went into Parliament, and for 7 years didn't even become a bag carrier to a bag carrier. I failed at all those things. I then did Weekend World and drove that programme to another level. So I've got to say that it just gets better and better.
That is really very, very encouraging, actually. Very encouraging. Well, I'll come back and I'll come back to the audience. Let me ask a little about your own careers and your own great life, Matthew. Because I suppose here's a question. You're a very sharp guy, and is being a columnist. Can a columnist be a great life? That's a question. It sort of sounds like an Oxford essay question, doesn't it? Or is a columnist always necessarily sort of influence without responsibility? I'd just be interested in how you view the role of the columnist. Really.
It's not the power without responsibility thing. Plenty of people who have had power without responsibility or responsibility without power have led interesting, perhaps great lives. But if you look at columnists that might now spring to our mind, and not many do, there are lots of columnists who are jolly famous in their day, but now we can't remember their names, but you might think of Ed Murrow, for instance, but the Second World War helped make him. You might think of Bernard Levin, but read collections. Every columnist in his or her pomp or vanity towards the end of their career publishes a collection of what they think is their best, work. And it isn't interesting, it isn't very good. It isn't nearly as good as you remembered it when you wrote it, or as your readers thought it was when you wrote it. And the answer to this, and here we reach an area of serious biography. The answer is that you can't see the wind. You can never see the wind. You can sometimes see things flapping in the wind. You can see the sails of a ship puffed out by the wind, but you can't see the wind. And the wind is what makes a time. And the wind is what a columnist ship, as it were, sails by. And when you write, as a columnist, you feel the wind of your times, of events, of very immediate events in your sails. That makes what you write, and it makes what you write interesting to those who read it. But when you come back to it, much later, the wind isn't there any longer. The sails just flap idly in the wind, and nobody can quite see what you or anybody was quite so excited about. It's why we can't understand the origins of the First World War, I think.
That's a really interesting article. Really interesting article. That we're making.
It will be.
But that's a very interesting answer. Do you feel that? I suppose the other thing that would be in my mind about a columnist is, are you authentic in columns? Is a columnist really themselves? Or so a very interesting columnist, actually, Boris Johnson, who wrote some very funny columns. He wrote some very controversial columns. He definitely could write. But I don't know, was he being himself, or was he always playing a role in those columns? So first answer it about Boris Johnson, because I'd be interested in what you say, and then about yourself. Are you being Matthew Parris, or are you playing the role of Matthew Parris writing a column? What would Matthew Parris, the columnist, say about this?
Well, start with Boris Johnson. There was a certain amount of incredulity. Reports a year or so ago that Boris has said that when he is writing columns, or when he was writing columns, he would try to work himself up into a state of passion, huge, either anger or love or whatever. So much so that he would start throwing things about the room about the subject that he was going to write about. And then when he got himself really psyched up, he would launch into the column. And that is absolutely true. It's a really interesting insight about what he says. British columnists, like everybody, or like British society, like the adversarial.
Yeah.
They like somebody going in with all guns firing, and just sort of knocking 7 bells out of another argument, or puffing up their own argument. And that now coming to me is what I find myself involuntarily doing. I'm much more like counsel for the defence or counsel for the prosecution, which is the way we decide or conduct our legal procedures, than I am like a dispassionate judge looking at both sides of the question and trying to come to a fair, reasonable and probably rather boring conclusion. That's your Financial Times columnist in it. No, I just like going in with all kinds of.
So you're sincere to yourself, though.
Yeah.
You are yourself, but you might work yourself into a somewhat stronger view.
Oh, exactly.
That's where whenever I have written columns, which is not very much, they're not very good because I'm very BBC about these things. I'm very kind of I don't want to be too unfair to the opposite point of view. And
you are basically a fair-minded man.
Well, it's been my disadvantage.
Your fate.
I can't help it. It's just, I think that's very interesting. Now, a word we've not used in the whole conversation so far about any of the great lines is courage. And I don't know where courage comes from, but I'd like you to talk about your own courage, because you will say stuff that many would regard as controversial or reckless sometimes. I mean, the recent examples I would cite are one about just gently treading into the trans issue. I know no controversy there. And saying Stonewall and gay rights and trans rights not the same issue. Why Stonewall, which you were one of those originally involved in. Why would you be mixing those all up? They're quite different things. Very courageous thing to say. Another one, much criticised, but by people I think who hadn't read it entirely, was the one about Gypsy Roma travellers and how we need to look after those people, integrate them, but we can't tolerate people just treading on private property with their caravans. Now, those were both things that were either reckless, mean, or courageous to say, and there will be people who will take all of those views about them. But they certainly would take some courage, and I'm interested in what you what the process was.
I think it could be all three actually, kind of reckless, sometimes a bit mean, but sometimes needing to be said. Which it kind of brings me to the second part of your earlier question. Am I just sort of playing a role? I am, but I have ideas, and I have, more than ideas, feelings, impressions, and I do run with those, and it gets me into trouble. I think probably one that got me into more trouble, or rather upset more people that I like than any of the others, was a few years ago, talking about immigration and talking about people who have recently come to a country needing to be a bit more careful about criticising it than those people who have been here for a very long time. And I know that upset a lot of people, but I also know that it's true. I've been in Derbyshire for 40 years, but I still would not criticise local people in the way that an insider can, because I'm an outsider. So yeah, that is difficult. I've just written something actually for my Times notebook tomorrow morning. Just a feeling that I have, that we need to be a bit careful as we look at these horrible scenes of what looks like a kind of genocide going on in Ukraine, and feel bounced into thinking we've just got to step in and stop this. I think a bit steady on about that. And what I tried to express in a way that will not sound unkind, but I don't think you can, is that probably the best thing is just to carry on this war of attrition until Putin is so weakened that he loses his authority within his own circle, rather than try and take that madman on now by what looks like a NATO incursion into Ukraine and risk horrible things that we don't know that he wouldn't do. But what am I saying? I'm basically saying that Ukrainians just have to suffer for a lot longer, and that's not an easy thing to say.
No, but saying things that are not easy is difficult. I suppose I'm interested in where courage comes from, and it's in your position. I suppose in a way, Matthew, you don't really have to care, do you?
No.
The Twitter mob will go off.
Well, I don't bother with it.
And it would upset me, and that would probably subtly be censoring me in things I might say, but for some reason it doesn't do that to you, and that must be because you're not much older, but you're a bit older, and you've been there, you've done it, you don't have to worry. Is that what gives you the courage to
Well,
say?
we're both from Southern Africa, and when I was a boy in South Africa, I spoke as I do now with the accent that I have, and all the boys I went to state schools in what was then Rhodesia, all the boys had Rhodesian accents. And I got mercilessly teased, not worse than teased actually, I got a really hard time. And my mother, I'm not sure if it was good advice or bad, but my mother said you just have to have moral courage. And she said, and you just take no notice of what anybody says.
She's
And
right,
I'm
yeah.
afraid I took it to heart, but it meant I didn't have any friends.
Right, let's go back to the floor. We've got a hand up at the back. I don't know if we're on the same subject.
Let me
but
stand up because I'm
yeah.
a long way back. Thanks very much. I'd like to pursue the courage bit because I think one of the biggest courages in many of these great lives is that they've changed their minds at some stage. They've done not necessarily evolved fast, but they've evolved from being what one might have expected them to being something greater, frequently. You see, I'm an avid follower. And I just wonder if there are any things in your own life that you've thought one way and now actually you've come around to thinking differently. And I give you the flag, which is Brexit. Do you have any uncertainties about where you once stood or thought about Brexit?
No, I mean Brexit was one of the...
Would it require moral courage?
It didn't require a lot of moral courage. I had 48% of those who voted on my side. No, I never had any doubt about that, and
you haven't changed your mind.
there are different reasons why you take positions. One is that I think it's better to be with our European allies than separate from them. But another was a lot of the people, not all of them, because I've got some very good friends and people I admire on the Brexit side, but too many of the people on the other side, I just didn't really think they were very good people, and I didn't like their instincts. And sometimes, rather than choose which idea to run with, choose which crowd to run with, I do that. No, I tell you one thing that did change my mind was when I got beaten up on Clapham Common. I was walking across Clapham Common in the hope of meeting another gay man, as people used to do, and I got beaten up by some yobs who'd just come onto the common and kicked me to the ground, broke my jaw and broke a few ribs, but I'm a good runner and I got up and ran away. And after that I decided, I was a member of Parliament at the time, and I decided I was not going to let go of this issue. You know, that there were people here who needed advocacy, and I never did let go of it after that.
Yes, well, it's been very, very interesting, and thank you both. And I wonder if either of you ever had childhood traumas to take you to where you are now. But that's not what I really want to ask about. You might be relieved to know. What I want to go back is to what Matthew said in the last session about women, and that women are very underrepresented, which is just a feature. I mean, my specialisation in biography is actually about women, and particularly women in politics. And I would like to know how you think you might address this, because there are women there. There are very interesting women who have interesting lives, who would be good on the programme. But things with women never just happen because people think they should do or it's a good idea. They happen generally because of concrete actions such as quotas. I'm not necessarily suggesting that you have quotas on the programme, but it sounds from very much what you said that something needs to be done about this to recognise those women who aren't recognised so far.
Interesting question.
I do believe in positive discrimination.
I bet there is though, Matthew, on the guests. The BBC has.
There is.
Yes,
On the guests, but not on the choice of
Firstly, I think we are more or less determined, without it ever being written down, that we will have as many women guests as we have male guests. Secondly, if somebody wants to champion the life of a woman, very often our guests come to us and say, can I come on your programme, champion this life? If it's a woman, she will have more chance of being championed than the equivalent man. And I'm a completely unashamed believer in positive discrimination. My mother was a school teacher. Anyone who is a school teacher knows that there'll be a little boy or girl at the back of the class who has some potential but just needs bringing on. And to bring people on, you have to give them their space, give them their platform. And women as a gender have needed the self-confidence that comes from seeing other women being famous, being celebrated in the media. And so, if I can do anything towards that, I would. It would also be true of ethnic minorities. I think an ethnic minority guest or an ethnic minority great life, I am slightly more interested in. Why not?
We've got a number. I'm going to take right at the back, and then we'll take. Sorry.
I just wondered if you'd ever featured Catherine Cookson in Great Lives. She was a great life, but she was rather derided by the literary establishment. And my goodness, did she have a traumatic upbringing? I believe she sold 123 million copies of her. But because she was regarded as rather below the pale, the other side of the pale, beyond the pale, that's what I'm trying to say, in terms of her literary abilities, I feel she may have been overlooked.
I don't think we have done her, and well, there's a good advertisement. If any of you are, or any of you know, someone who would like to champion Catherine Cookson, I reckon we have a pretty good chance of wanting to do it.
We need to be absolutely out of here, cleared up and everything by 8, so we'll have time for a couple more, and I've got a last question. Sorry, both of you. We'll take both these questions. Yeah, both of you. Yeah, you go first.
No, I was
a recent expert witness.
Expert witness, yes, and there's an example.
What did you do?
Well, Matthew's producer asked Janet Ellis, the Blue Peter lady, to propose someone. She proposed Kay Webb, and I happened to be the biographer of Kay Webb.
Yes.
So I happened. So there we were 3 women, you see.
Yes.
2 women talking about a woman, and redressing the balance like mad. Suddenly, your tiny scientific theory about the fractured childhood. I used to have one when I used to have to interview somebody every week, somebody different, who was in the news.
This is Valerie Grove speaking. Those are the back.
Sorry.
Yes.
Yes. That I used to have a question, and I'm going to put it to you. I used to say, well, at some point I'd say, are you the eldest or the only child? And I can tell you that 90% of the people I ever interviewed were eldest or onlys. And I had this, the Germans have a word for it, how many are you in your family? But there was such a preponderance of people Harold Pinter, Roy Hattersley, Roy Jenkins, Arnold Westcott, Kingsley Amis, Melvin Bragg, only children. That stands out a mile. Put your head up above the parapet, no matter how humbly you start or how diffidently.
I'm the eldest of 6 children.
Yes, that's quite an exceptional thing. One person.
Someone should go back and study the whole series and do a kind of a kind of 20 different correlations of oldest, youngest, left-handed, dyslexic. Anything we know. I mean, all these theories that come through.
Illness in childhood, very important. The loss of one or both parents at a young age, very important.
Colonial background.
Yes, very important. Moving from one country, dislocation from one country, one language to another, also very important.
I'm going to take a last question. Is it Robbie?
Yeah.
Go on.
Just when you're doing the Great Lives, do you find yourself drawn to or drawn away from the subjects? You start liking them or disliking them, and if you do, does that affect how you think about their greatness yourself and whether you can creating for listeners a kind of an honest appraisal of their greatness. Is the kind of personal connection come into it?
I'm kind of ransacking my mind for examples of what I know I want to say, which is that I often see the life and I think, oh, I don't like her, I don't like him, oh, this person's really overrated. And I'm quite often persuaded by my guest to change my mind actually during the course of our conversation. I start our programmes without having done much more than just read Wikipedia. I am really finding out during the programme. I am asking our expert witness, I am asking our guest, and they can usually persuade me. On the other hand, I think it's also quite a good idea to confront the guest with the weaknesses of their choice, if the choice is weak. And I can't remember who chose Margot Fontaine. It might have been Edwina Curry, but I don't think it was. But anyway, my guest at the end said she had decided she didn't actually like her choice really as much as she thought she would.
Just a last question, Matthew. How important is it in understanding lives that the accounts we have of them are truthful? And I don't just mean that there aren't lies, but that we obviously do build up myths of characters, don't we? We decomplicate the narrative of their life by, like a columnist, by taking the case for the defence, and in that process we may not be praising all the evidence of their entire life with equal weight. We may be stripping out with confirmation biases, with all sorts of other motivations, motivated reasoning. We may be simplifying their life and creating a myth around them. I just wonder whether that is something that biographers need to worry about, whether your programme needs to worry about, or whether indeed, as in that one great episode of The Simpsons, which is about Lisa uncovering the truth about the character in the town of Springfield, that he was a horrible, horrible man, then just delivering a lecture to the town on what a great man he was, because she realised the myth was more important than the truth. I would just be interested in a reflection on myth and truth in public discourse around characters.
I think I don't agree with you. It is sometimes the case that a myth, very often a myth that builds a character up, has arisen around a person. But I think in British biography anyway, this almost immediately attracts an equal and opposite reaction, and you get somebody wanting to knock them down. And I would say from some of the lives that I've done, that so far from encountering something that is too simple, or building up something that is too simple, too black and white, too dimensional, the more you go into a life, the more complicated it becomes, the more ambiguous it becomes, the more sympathy you have with the sins, or the less admiration you have for the virtues, and the whole thing begins to fragment, as any life would if we looked at it if we put the microscope in upon it. So I'm not too worried about heroification or simplification. That will find, I think, its own corrective.
Well, that is a great note for a biography event. I think I'll move to finish, and at this point I would say, Matthew, thank you very much.
Evan, with his impeccable BBC timing, to have conducted such a stimulating conversation with Matthew, throwing up all these infinite biographical conundrums and dealing with them like his programmes and like his columns, with both a great, very entertainingly and very thought-provokingly. So thank you both. We're delighted you came, and another